Hello friends, this is Sarah,
This is Christina.
and we are from the RALE SIG working on our Goggles project. So Goggles is a CSS-based contextual approach to understanding professional examples and as learning materials, and really grew out of a lot of the need-finding work that Nicole, Michael, and I had done last quarter. And so the crux of our project sort of focuses on the alternate ways you can implement particular effects and front-end techniques using CSS and, to a lesser extent, HTML and jQuery and other JavaScript effect and event-based libraries. So if you think about a lot of the problems that people face when they're just starting out as intermediate web developers, there are a lot of challenges that crop up frequently. For instance, how do I vertically center an element, a block formatted element in CSS? There's a bunch of different ways you can do it, and each of them has different side effects. And a lot of these side effects are not immediately apparent to learners when they implement it in a small setting, but as you scale your system and build, the other components of your web page, etc., it can soon become clear that something's not working, and people don't really understand why that's the case. Other things including like a 3-column layout or just having a footer stick to the bottom of the screen are all effects that learners can be familiar with and have seen on other websites that they frequent, but not understand how to implement themselves. And so learners can always do the usual process of Googling how do I implement like parallax scrolling, or how do I implement an image hover or something like that. And there are a lot of Stack Overflow answers and articles that do compare techniques and implementations and describe sort of the best practices of the moment and canonical ways to do stuff. The problems with these that we uncovered through need finding, which Christina will talk about in a moment, are that first, these articles tend to be abstracted from the particular outcome that the user wants, especially if they have an example on a given website that they use a lot of the exact way they want the technique to be implemented. Second is that a lot of these articles are tech agnostic or assume a specific stack that might not be compatible with what the learner wants, and the learner might not know that, so when they go to try to follow the instructions to get something working or set it up, and they're like, oh, now I have to gulp install all of these things, that quickly makes the whole experience a lot more confusing than just understanding exactly what is the minimum amount of code they need to implement the technique. And finally, there's no real way for learners to compare these techniques or understand or defend their decisions to go with a particular implementation, which makes it hard both for systems to scale, for their projects to scale later on, as well as for them to sort of feel like they're not just groping around blindly in the dark.
Yeah, so for need finding, we really wanted to focus in on looking through how users go through tutorials and instructional material now, and just how they go about learning web techniques. So we observed users going through a specific tutorial about angular scopes, and we realized a couple things from this. The users were generally able to identify knowledge gaps while they're going through the tutorial. And this could mean either that they could recognize exactly what was missing or exactly what they didn't know or had to go look up later, and a lot of our users did that, or they knew something was missing, but they weren't exactly sure what. And also that in some scenarios, without enough previous experience and knowledge, users had no idea what knowledge gap they even had. We also noticed that while users were going through tutorials, they had a tendency to scroll really quickly through the text and only focus on looking at the code snippets. One of our users had actually even said that they prefer to just look at the code snippets, and if they can make sense of it, then they don't end up reading the text, and they only read the text when they can't understand the code snippet. Another part was that it wasn't interactive enough, and the examples that they showed were a little too limited to the fact that at the end of the tutorial they weren't sure if scopes were only for a specific type of use versus like multiple uses. So this limited our users in thinking of like what they were actually learning. And then also, just from our interviewing users on how they normally learn new web techniques, we found that users primarily already knew what they wanted to do at the end. They already had an idea of like what they wanted to build at the end and what that looked like, and that's how they usually went about trying to learn specific techniques or specific ways to implement something based on what they already had in mind.
So our research questions as a result of this need finding are sort of conceptually related to the viability and utility of professional examples in general. So in particular, we're interested in, first, what do learners want to know that are not being fulfilled by existing instructional materials, where those are things like tutorials that have already been written out, interactive tutorials such as those you can fork on GitHub, as well as like articles on people's blogs that sort of just are expository summaries of different ways to do things in CSS, etc. We're moreover interested in whether professional contextual examples are able to address any of these issues for learners in ways that the existing and formally constructed instructional materials can't. And even if they aren't able to, say, fill a gap for learners in ways that instructional materials are like totally unable to cover right now, we're also interested in seeing whether people who create instructional materials can make use of professional and contextual examples and systems for uncovering these examples to augment their instructional materials. So for instance, if I'm writing a tutorial that shows you how to implement a responsive grid layout using a particular technique, can I point to websites that have that make use of this technique and show sort of in the code what techniques where the techniques are being implemented in like their style sheets for the whole website, and will that help a learner understand my tutorial more effectively than were I to scaffold some dummy example and like host it on a repo in GitHub?
Yeah, so after we did our need finding and came up with research questions that we wanted to go into, we did some storyboarding to try to figure out what kind of interaction we expected our tool to have. And so what we ultimately ended up deciding was to follow kind of like a goggles model where our tool kind of gives you like an additional layer on top of a page that you're looking at, and it'll let you know whether or not a technique that you're looking for exists on the page and what that technique actually looks like from that page. So I can actually show you an example of it now. So currently we have it as a bookmarklet, and we're hoping to next quarter, next steps is going to be moving it to a Chrome extension. So what you do is you drag the bookmarklet into your bookmarks, and then you can go to a page such as, so currently it's already hard coded in, so currently it's looking for clear fix techniques, and if a page is using clear fix, you can press the bookmarklet once you're on the page that you think that technique exists on. And so in this scenario for Engadget, they're using clear fix on this navigation bar, and the specific example of clear fix is a micro clear fix. So it shows you what it actually does and what the CSS code actually looks like for Engadget here. We also worked on a learner panel, so this is where the user would actually be able to input the techniques that they wanted to do. So in this case, you have ClearFix. You can see examples of it. It's not working yet, but this is more like a watch list, so users can specifically identify which techniques they want to look at, which techniques they're hoping to find while they're browsing around. And so what our code actually does here is, so for ClearFix specifically, we have two types of ClearFix that we're looking at. So it's ClearFix display and micro ClearFix. And so then for our find functionality, this is specifically for here. So we have a find ClearFix method. So we want to eventually generalize this out to other techniques, but we just wanted to prove that we could actually do this. So what it does is it pulls in the it looks for elements right now that are named ClearFix, because that's what we found was a common way that people actually did ClearFix implementations. And then we'll get the elements from the page that we're on, and then from there we'll actually compare the CSS that is applied to ClearFix elements there and compare it to the ClearFix spec that we've had here, which is either ClearFix display or micro ClearFix. And so depending on whether or not the CSS that we pulled matches one of these, then we'll return you the actual CSS code that they're using and what kind of ClearFix that they're using.
So the next steps for this particular project are, first we want to be able to do a formal study with learners who have whom we previously talked to and have expressed an interest in being able to understand how techniques are implemented on particular websites. And the second, more broader question that we're interested in is generalizing this approach to different techniques will require a model for how we get the patterns that we're looking for. So in the example that Christina just showed, the way we have a specification, for instance, for two techniques for ClearFix in this one, and these are based off of the CSS rules and ways in which you can implement the ClearFix behavior. And in particular, we know for a fact that you could do it one way by setting the display property to one of these values. You could also do it another way by using pseudo elements here. And so as long as we have sort of a schema for the different implementations of a technique, we can programmatically search for this. Obviously, in order to generalize this to more diverse types of effects, as well as ones that use JavaScript, as well as ones that use JavaScript, we need to be able to develop sort of reliable heuristics for not only detecting particular implementations, but also categorizing the ways in which you can implement these techniques. And there's some idea that this can be done just based on the fact that there are people who are experts or domain experts for CSS, for example, who write blog posts that summarize the different methods in which you can implement something like a 3-column layout. This suggests that we could generalize from these types of examples to find rules that we can use to search for in real websites. And the second approach that we're interested in, sort of along those lines, is a crowdsourced one. So if an expert or even someone, or just anyone browsing the web, could point to an element and be like, oh, this is vertically centered, then we can sort of quickly draw a body of information that has to do with, that connects the different implementations and outcomes to how they're implemented, that connects different effects and outcomes as someone can identify them on the page, and then tracks how they're implemented in the source code. And so either of these paths would be a better way for us to generalize this technique and this interaction model to a bunch of different effects, and we're interested in seeing which ones of these are the most effective.
Sweet. Catch you next quarter.
Thanks, friends.
Bye.